The alarms went off before I even saw the ship. I was under a coolant pipe with a wrench in my hand when the whole base shook, and someone screamed that something had broken through the upper atmosphere without any warning at all. I dropped the wrench, grabbed my jacket, and ran outside with grease still on my fingers, because that is what you do when the sky turns orange and the ground starts humming under your boots. My name is Daniel Hart. I fix generators and water systems for a living. I am not a soldier, not a diplomat, not anyone important. That is exactly why what happened next made no sense to me, or to anyone else standing on that landing field that morning. The ship came down slow, like it wasn't afraid of anything, which was strange because every human weapon on the base was already pointed at it. It was silver and smooth, shaped like a folded leaf, and it landed without a sound, without even bending the grass under it. Soldiers formed a line. Officers shouted orders. Somewhere behind me, a general named Marcus Kane was already speaking fast into a radio, trying to figure out who was supposed to be in charge of a first contact nobody had trained for. I should not have been anywhere near the front of that crowd. I was only there because my shift required me to check the backup power lines near the landing field, and now I was stuck, pressed between a row of soldiers and a fence, watching a door open on the side of the alien ship, like a mouth taking its first breath of our air. She stepped out first. I did not know her name yet. I only knew she was tall, taller than most people around me, with skin that had a faint golden shimmer under the morning sun, and eyes that were a shade of violet I had never seen on anything alive. She wore a long silver coat that moved like water, and behind her came 6 others, all armed, all silent, all watching us like we were something fragile that might break if they moved too fast. Nobody spoke. Not the general, not the ambassador standing beside him, not the dozens of cameras that had somehow already been set up to record this moment for the entire world to see. She looked at us, not at the guns, not at the officers with their medals and their careful uniforms. She looked past all of them, scanning the crowd like she was searching for something specific, something she already expected to find. Then her eyes stopped on me. I remember thinking, stupidly, that she must be looking at something behind me, because there was no reason on this earth, or any other, for an alien princess to care about a maintenance technician holding a bag of tools. But she did not look away. She walked forward, past the ambassador, past the soldiers who tensed but did not fire, past everyone whose entire career had been built around a moment like this, and she stopped less than 3 feet in front of me. Up close, she was even stranger and more beautiful than she looked from a distance. Her skin had faint patterns under it, like veins of light, moving slowly, almost like breathing. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm and clear, and every word came out in perfect English, like she had learned it just for this moment. "I need a husband," she said. And then she pointed at me. I laughed. I actually laughed, right there in front of generals and cameras and an alien delegation, because my brain could not process what I had just heard. Someone behind me dropped a rifle. Someone else started shouting into a radio. The ambassador looked like he might faint. I just stood there with my mouth open, waiting for someone to tell me this was a joke, a test, a mistake in translation. Nobody told me that. "I am sorry," she said, tilting her head slightly, watching my confusion like it was something new and interesting to her. "Is this not how your customs work? I was told humans value directness." "Ma'am," I managed to say, my voice cracking in a way that embarrassed me even in that moment of pure chaos. "I think there's been some kind of mistake." "There is no mistake," she said. "You are the one." General Kane stepped forward then, his face pale, his hand raised like he was trying to calm a room that had already gone completely out of control. "Your Highness," he said carefully, "perhaps we should discuss this somewhere private, with proper translators and advisors." "I do not need translators," she said, without even looking at him. "And I have already chosen. This is not a request. It is a necessity." Those words hit differently than the first ones had. Necessity. Not love, not attraction, not even curiosity. A need, like water or air, something required for survival. I did not understand it yet, but something in the way she said it made my stomach twist, because it sounded less like an alien princess falling for a random human technician and more like a diagnosis being read aloud in a hospital room. They pulled me aside within minutes. Soldiers surrounded me, not to hurt me, but to protect me, though from what, I still did not know. I was pushed into a black vehicle before I could even say goodbye to the co-workers I had been standing with only an hour earlier. Through the tinted window, I watched the alien princess walk calmly back toward her ship, her guards falling into step around her, like nothing unusual had just happened at all. The base went into full lockdown within the hour. Nobody would tell me anything. I sat in a small gray room with a table, 2 chairs, and a mirror that I was fairly sure hid people watching me from the other side. My hands were still shaking a little, and I remember staring at the grease stains on my fingers, thinking about how strange it was that only that morning my biggest problem had been a clogged coolant line. The door opened, and a woman in a dark suit walked in, introducing herself as Ellen Ross, part of the diplomatic team assigned to the alien contact. She had tired eyes and a calm voice, the kind of voice people use when they are trying very hard not to panic in front of someone else. "Mr. Hart," she said, sitting across from me, "I need you to understand that what happened out there has already become the single most important event in human history." "I understand that people are scared," I said. "I'm scared too. But I don't understand why." She pointed at me. "I've never seen her before in my life." "Neither had she, as far as we can tell," Ellen said, "which is what makes this so difficult to explain." She placed a folder on the table, thin, mostly empty, except for a few printed pages. "Their scanners picked up something in you the moment their ship entered orbit. We don't fully understand their technology yet, but from what little we can translate, it seems your biology matched something they were specifically searching for." "Matched what?" I asked. What could a random guy who fixes water pumps have that an entire alien empire needs? Ellen hesitated, which worried me more than anything she had said so far. "We don't know yet, but she has made it very clear that she is not leaving without you." I laughed again, though this time it came out hollow, tired. "So what, I just go with her? No conversation, no choice, no anything?" "You have a choice," Ellen said carefully, "but I would be lying if I said there wasn't enormous pressure from every government on this planet for you to make the right one." That night, I lay on a cot in a room I wasn't allowed to leave, staring at a ceiling that felt too close, thinking about how strange it was that hours earlier, my biggest worry had been getting home in time to feed my dog. Now the entire planet seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what a maintenance technician from a small town would decide to do about an alien princess who had looked at a crowd of thousands and chosen him like he was the only person standing there. I did not know yet that this decision would change more than my own life. I did not know that somewhere above the clouds, an empire far older than humanity was quietly dying, and that whatever they had found in me might be the only thing standing between survival and extinction for a species I had never even heard of that morning. All I knew, lying there in the dark, was that the woman who had pointed at me had eyes that did not look like someone falling in love. They looked like someone counting down the seconds on a clock only she could see, and I was somehow now a part of that countdown, whether I wanted to be or not. The next morning, they told me she was requesting to see me again, alone this time, without soldiers, without officials, without anyone standing between us. And as strange as it sounds, despite every warning bell going off in my head, I found myself agreeing to go, because some part of me needed to hear her explain, in her own words, why out of billions of people on this planet, she had chosen to stop in front of me and change my entire life with 4 simple words. They took me to a small room inside their ship instead of a base building, which surprised me more than I expected. The walls were smooth and pale, curved instead of flat, and there were no visible screens or controls anywhere, just soft light that seemed to come from the walls themselves. She was already waiting when I arrived, sitting on a low seat that looked more like a folded piece of fabric than actual furniture, and she stood the moment I stepped through the door. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I was told humans sometimes refuse things they do not understand." "I still don't understand," I said. "That's kind of why I came." She gestured toward a seat across from her, and I sat, my hands resting on my knees, trying to look calmer than I felt. Up close, without cameras or soldiers around us, she seemed less like a symbol of an alien invasion and more like a person carrying something heavy that she had been carrying for a very long time. "My name is Elsara," she said. "I am the crown princess of the Zarathi Empire. I imagine your people have already given us a name of their own." "They're calling you the Zarathi," I said. "Not very creative, but it works." The corner of her mouth moved slightly, something close to a smile, though it faded fast. "I did not choose you because of feeling, Daniel Hart. I want to be honest with you, because I think you deserve that, more than any of the people who have been speaking around you since yesterday." "Okay," I said slowly. "Then why did you choose me?" She took a breath, the kind of breath someone takes before saying something they have said many times in their own head, but never out loud to another person. "My people are dying," she said. "Not quickly. Not in a way your scientist could easily detect from orbit, but dying, slowly, over generations, because of choices made long before either of us existed." She explained it carefully, in simple words, like she had practiced explaining it to someone who had no context for any of it. The Zarathi Empire had ruled for thousands of years, and their ruling bloodline, the family she belonged to, had followed a strict law requiring marriage only within a small number of noble houses. It was meant to preserve power and tradition. Instead, over centuries, it had slowly poisoned their gene pool, causing illness, weakness, and a shrinking population among the very family meant to lead billions of their people. "Your scientists would call it a genetic bottleneck," she said. "We have known about it for generations, but our laws made it impossible to fix. Any attempt to marry outside the noble houses was treated as treason. My own mother argued for change for decades and was ignored." "So what changed?" I asked. "Desperation," she said simply. "Our healers determined that without new genetic material, the royal bloodline would collapse within 3 more generations. No royal family means no clear leadership, and for an empire our size, that means chaos, and possibly war between houses fighting to fill the gap. I was given permission to search beyond our borders, quietly, before anyone even knew we had made contact with your planet." "And your scanners just picked me out of a crowd?" I asked, still struggling to believe any of this was real. "Your biology contains markers our scientists have never seen in any species we have previously studied," she said. "Something in your genetic structure could correct instabilities in ours, not just in me, but potentially in future generations of my family. I did not choose you because you are handsome, though you are not unpleasant to look at. I chose you because a scan taken from orbit told me you might be the only chance my people have to survive without a war tearing them apart." I sat there for a long moment, trying to process what she had just told me. It should have felt insulting, being reduced to a set of genetic markers instead of a person, but there was something in the way she said it, tired and honest, that made me feel less like a tool and more like someone she trusted enough to tell the truth. "That's a lot of pressure to put on one guy who fixes water pumps for a living," I said finally. "I am aware," she said. "I did not enjoy pointing at a stranger in front of cameras from your entire planet. I would have preferred privacy, dignity, time to explain things properly before asking anything of you. But my advisors insisted on a public announcement to prevent political interference from those who might try to hide or eliminate you before I could reach you." That last part sent a chill through me. "Eliminate me? Why would anyone want to hurt me over this?" Elsara's expression darkened slightly, the golden light beneath her skin dimming for just a moment. "Because not everyone in my empire wants this problem solved the way I intend to solve it," she said. There are noble houses who benefit from the current laws, families who profit from arranged marriages within our own bloodlines, even during our decline. If I succeed in changing the succession laws to include an outsider, their power crumbles with it. Some would rather see the royal family fail than share it with someone they consider beneath them. So I'm not just marrying you, I said slowly. I'm walking into some kind of political war. Yes, she said, without softening it at all. I will not lie to you about the danger, Daniel Hart. If you choose to come with me, you will be protected as much as I am able to protect you, but I cannot promise you safety. I can only promise you honesty and my own effort to keep you alive. Back on Earth, while I was inside that ship trying to process everything she had told me, the rest of the planet was losing its mind in a much louder way. Ellen Ross later showed me footage from news channels around the world, all of them replaying the moment Ailsara pointed at me, over and over, slowed down, zoomed in, analyzed by experts who had absolutely no idea what they were talking about. Some governments saw an opportunity for alliance and technology sharing. Others saw a threat, worried that whatever the Zarathi wanted from humanity might not stop with one maintenance technician. My own face was suddenly on every screen on the planet, and I had not even agreed to anything yet. General Kane pulled me aside before I returned to the ship for a second visit, his expression serious in a way that made it clear this conversation mattered more than most of the ones happening around us. "Son," he said, "I want you to understand something. Whatever you decide, world leaders are already treating this as the opening move in a relationship between our species. If you say no, some people up the chain will see that as a lost opportunity that might not come again." "And if I say yes?" I asked. "Then you become the most important civilian on this planet," he said. For better or worse. I did not sleep much that night either. I kept thinking about Ailsara's face when she talked about her mother arguing for change and being ignored for decades, about the tiredness in her voice when she described her people slowly dying because of laws written long before either of us was born. It would have been easy to see her as simply using me, a convenient genetic solution to a political problem. But something about the honesty in how she explained it, the fact that she did not try to dress it up as romance or destiny, made me trust her more than I expected to. The next few days blurred together in a mix of briefings, medical scans, and careful negotiations between human governments and the Zarathi delegation. Scientists on both sides studied whatever data they were allowed to share, confirming, as much as anyone could confirm anything about alien biology, that Ailsara had been telling the truth about the genetic compatibility. It was strange, sitting in sterile white rooms while doctors from two different worlds argued quietly over screens filled with numbers I could not understand, knowing that somewhere in all that data was the reason my entire life had been rewritten in less than a week. Oliver Grant, a friend from my old maintenance crew, managed to get a message through to me during that time, and it was almost funny how normal his words sounded compared to everything else happening around me. He asked if I was okay, if the food on the alien ship was any good, if I needed him to feed my dog while all this got sorted out. It was a small thing, but it reminded me that somewhere underneath all the politics and pressure, I was still just a person whose life had been interrupted in the strangest way imaginable. On the fifth day, Ailsara requested another private meeting, and this time, instead of explaining the crisis facing her people, she asked me questions about myself, what my life had been like before all this, whether I had family, what it felt like to grow up on a planet where survival was not something entire species had to plan centuries in advance to secure. I found myself talking more freely than I expected to, telling her about my parents, about the small town I grew up in, about the strange comfort of fixing broken machines and watching them work again. "You like repairing things," she said, more of an observation than a question. "I guess I do," I said. "There's something satisfying about finding what's broken and putting it back together." She looked at me for a long moment, something unreadable behind her violet eyes. "Perhaps that is fitting," she said quietly, "because what you are being asked to help repair is far larger than any machine. By the end of that week, I had made my decision, though it did not feel like a single moment of clarity, so much as a slow realization that I had already started caring about the outcome, about her, about the billions of people I would never meet, whose future depended on choices being made in small gray rooms and curved alien chambers far above the world I had grown up in. I told Ellen Ross I was ready to go with Elsara to her homeworld, not because governments were pressuring me, not because cameras were watching, but because I wanted to understand the rest of the story she had only begun to tell me. What I did not know yet was how dangerous that story would become the moment I stepped off Earth and into a court built on centuries of tradition that my very existence was about to challenge. The journey to the Zarathi homeworld took 3 days by their measurement of time, though it felt much longer to me. Locked inside a ship with no windows I was allowed to look through, and no clear sense of how far we had traveled from everything I had ever known. Elsara visited me twice during that journey, mostly to prepare me for what waited on the other end, but nothing she said could have fully prepared me for the moment we finally landed. The homeworld of the Zarathi was nothing like I expected. I had pictured something cold and mechanical, all metal and glass, but instead I stepped out onto a platform overlooking a city built into the side of a massive cliff, towers rising and falling with the natural shape of the stone, covered in gardens that glowed faintly under a sky the color of soft amber. It was beautiful in a way that made my chest ache a little, knowing that somewhere beneath that beauty was a system slowly killing the people who ruled it. I was given quarters inside the royal palace, rooms far larger and more elegant than anything I had ever lived in, with a view over gardens that seemed to shift color depending on the time of day. A woman named Yura Thess was assigned to help me adjust, a quiet, sharp-eyed member of the royal guard who clearly did not trust me, but was professional enough not to show it openly. "You are to be introduced to the court tomorrow," she told me during my first evening there, her tone even, careful. "I would advise you to say little and observe much. Not everyone here wishes you well." "That's comforting," I said. "It is honest," she replied, "which I have been told your people value." The introduction the next day was unlike anything I had experienced. The throne room was massive, filled with nobles wearing layered robes in colors I had no names for, all of them watching me with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. Elsara stood beside her father, the reigning emperor, a tall man with tired eyes and a voice that carried easily across the enormous hall, despite how quietly he seemed to speak. "This is the one my daughter has chosen," the emperor said, his gaze sweeping over the crowd of nobles. "The healers have confirmed the compatibility. I trust this council to accept my daughter's judgment in this matter." The silence that followed was heavier than any noise could have been. I felt dozens of eyes studying me, some with curiosity, most with something colder. Near the front of the crowd stood a man with sharp features and dark green robes, watching me with an expression that made the hair on my arms stand up, even before he spoke. "Forgive me, Your Majesty," the man said, his voice smooth, almost pleasant, "but are we truly meant to accept an outsider, a creature from an unknown world, into the bloodline that has ruled this empire for 1,000 generations? His biology has been confirmed compatible, Lord Vesic," Elsara said, before her father could answer. "That is more than can be said for several of the arranged unions your own house has proposed over the years." A few quiet gasps rippled through the crowd, and Lord Vesic's expression tightened, though he kept his voice level. "The princess is passionate, as always. But passion does not change the fact that our laws exist for a reason. The stability of our empire depends on preserving the purity of the royal bloodline." "The purity of the royal bloodline," Elsara said, "is precisely what has been slowly killing us for generations, Lord Vesic. I would think a man of your intelligence could see that." The exchange ended there, but the tension in that room did not fade, and I understood, watching the careful way certain nobles glanced at each other, that Lord Vesic was far from the only person in that hall who saw me as a problem rather than a solution. Over the following weeks, I began to understand the shape of the danger surrounding me. The Zarathi court was built on centuries of alliances between noble houses, many of them tied together through generations of arranged marriages that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with power. My presence threatened to break that structure entirely, because if the succession laws changed to allow outsiders, several powerful families would lose the influence they had spent centuries building through careful, controlled bloodlines. Eurythes became something close to a friend during that time, despite her initial coldness, mostly because she was one of the few people willing to speak plainly with me instead of hiding behind careful court language. She warned me early on that Lord Vesic was not simply opposed to me out of tradition. His house profits from the current succession laws, she told me one evening as we walked through one of the palace gardens, the amber sky deepening into a soft violet overhead. If the princess marries outside the noble houses, several long-standing marriage contracts become worthless overnight. Contracts worth more wealth and influence than you could imagine. So this isn't really about purity at all, I said. Purity is the excuse, she said. Power is the reason. It usually is, in matters like this. The first attempt on my life came almost a month after my arrival, quiet and nearly successful in its simplicity. I had been given a set of formal robes to wear for a court dinner, delivered by palace staff the evening before, and it was only by chance that Yura noticed a faint discoloration along the collar before I put it on, a subtle chemical treatment designed to slowly poison anyone who wore it against their skin for an extended period. The staff member who had delivered the robes disappeared before anyone could question them, and though no one could prove Lord Vesic's involvement, everyone in the palace seemed to understand quietly who was responsible. Aelsara was furious, in a way I had not seen from her before, her calm composure cracking as she stood in my quarters afterward, staring at the discarded robes like they had personally offended her. "I should never have brought you here without more protection," she said. "I underestimated how far some of these houses would go." "I'm still alive," I said, trying to sound calmer than I felt. "That's something." "It should not have to be something you have to be grateful for," she said quietly. "You did not ask for any of this danger." Despite the fear that attempt planted in me, I found myself growing closer to Aelsara during those weeks, not because either of us had time to properly court each other in any traditional sense, but because we were constantly forced into each other's company, planning strategy, discussing which nobles might be trusted, which needed to be watched carefully. She was sharper than I had first realized, capable of arguing complex law with the same calm precision she used when explaining her people's genetic crisis to me on our first private meeting. I found myself admiring her, not because I was supposed to, not because our marriage had been framed as a necessity from the very beginning, but because she carried the weight of an entire empire's survival on her shoulders and still made time to ask if I was adjusting to their food, their customs, their strange, beautiful, dangerous world. The political tension came to a head almost 2 months after my arrival, during what was meant to be a routine council session discussing trade agreements with a neighboring system. Lord Vesic stood before the assembled nobles, and instead of discussing trade, he raised a formal challenge to the succession, claiming that Aelsara's judgment had been compromised by what he called an unnatural attachment to an outsider, and that the safety of the empire required her removal from the line of succession until the matter could be properly investigated by the full council. It was, I later learned, the opening move of a carefully planned attempt to seize control before Aelsara could formalize our marriage and change the succession laws permanently. Several other noble houses, ones who had remained quiet until that point, suddenly voiced their support for Lord Vesic's challenge, and I realized, watching the room shift beneath me, that we had walked directly into a trap that had been building since the day I arrived. The emperor, weakened by illness that I had not fully understood until that moment, struggled to maintain control of the council session, and for the first time since I had arrived on their homeworld, I saw genuine fear in Ailsara's expression as she realized how many of the nobles in that room were prepared to support a challenge that could strip her of everything, her title, her authority, and quite possibly her life. This council does not have the authority to remove a rightful heir based on unfounded accusations, Ailsara said, her voice steady despite the tension radiating from every corner of the room. This council has the authority to protect the empire from instability, Lord Vesic replied smoothly. And I believe recent events, including an attempted poisoning that conveniently failed to implicate anyone of note, suggest instability has already found its way into this palace. The insinuation was clear, even to me. He was suggesting, without saying it outright, that the poisoning attempt on my life had been staged, perhaps even by Ailsara herself, to gain sympathy and support for her cause. It was a bold, dangerous lie, and watching several nobles nod along with his words, I understood how close we were to losing everything. That night, Yura came to my quarters with news that made my stomach drop entirely. Lord Vesic has gathered enough support among the council to force a formal vote within the week, she said. If the vote passes, Princess Ailsara will be stripped of her position pending investigation, and control of the succession will fall to a regent council, one that Lord Vesic has already arranged to lead. That's a coup, I said. That's just a coup, with extra paperwork. Yes, Yura said grimly, and unless something changes before that vote, it will succeed. I found Ailsara alone in one of the palace's quiet upper chambers, staring out over the amber city below, her expression more exhausted than I had ever seen it. She did not turn when I entered, though she clearly heard me approach. I have spent my entire life trying to save my people from a slow death, she said quietly. And now I may lose everything to men who care more about their own power than the survival of the empire they claim to serve. Then we stop them, I said. She turned to look at me then, something between disbelief and desperate hope crossing her face. How, Daniel Hart? You are not a soldier. You are not a politician. You have no allies in this court beyond myself and a handful of guards. Maybe not, I said. But I fix broken things for a living, and right now, this whole system is broken. Maybe it's time someone outside it took a look at how to put it back together. She studied me for a long moment, and for the first time since I had arrived on her world, I saw something shift behind her eyes, not just gratitude, but a flicker of real hope, fragile but present, that perhaps the very thing making me an outsider in this rigid, ancient court might also be the thing capable of saving it. We had 6 days before the vote, and every one of them felt shorter than the last. Yura Thes became the closest thing I had to a strategist, since she understood the council's rules better than anyone else willing to help us, and together with Ailsara, we began looking for a way to break Lord Vesic's growing coalition before the formal vote could take place. The first thing I noticed, sitting through hours of briefings about council procedure and noble house alliances, was that almost everyone around me was thinking about this fight the same way they had thought about every political fight in Zorathi history, through the lens of tradition, favors owed, and centuries-old alliances between noble families. It was a rigid, predictable kind of warfare, and Lord Vesic was clearly a master of it, which was exactly why he had gathered so much support so quickly. He's playing by the rules everyone expects, I said during one of our late-night planning sessions. That's his strength. Nobody's fighting him outside those rules, because nobody here thinks to. What do you suggest instead? Ailsara asked, tired but attentive. We stop playing his game, I said. You've told me the noble houses support him because they profit from the current succession laws. But you've also told me the common people, the ones who aren't part of any noble house, are the ones actually suffering under the instability those laws cause. What if they knew the truth about why this vote is really happening? Yura frowned slightly. The common people have no formal voice in council votes. Their opinion, however strong, cannot change the outcome directly. No, I said, but public pressure can change how individual nobles vote, especially ones who are on the fence, worried more about their own reputation than about protecting Lord Vesic's power. It was a strange kind of plan, unfamiliar to a court that had operated the same rigid way for centuries, but Ailsara agreed to try it, and over the following days, we worked carefully to get the truth in front of as many ordinary Zarathi citizens as possible, using public broadcasts normally reserved for ceremonial announcements to explain, plainly and honestly, why the succession laws had brought their empire to the edge of collapse, and how Lord Vesic's challenge was less about protecting tradition and more about protecting his own family's wealth. It worked better than any of us expected, though not without cost. Crowds began gathering outside the palace gates, some in support of Ailsara, others confused or angry, unsure what to believe after centuries of being told the royal bloodline's purity was sacred and untouchable. Several smaller noble houses, ones with less to lose than Lord Vesic's, began quietly withdrawing their support from his coalition, worried about how their own people back home might react if they were seen actively working against a princess trying to save their empire from decline. Lord Vesic noticed the shift almost immediately, and his response was faster and more dangerous than any of us anticipated. 2 nights before the vote, an explosion tore through one of the lower palace corridors, close enough to where Ailsara had been walking only minutes earlier that the timing could not have been coincidence. 3 guards were injured, and though no one could immediately prove who was responsible, everyone understood, once again, exactly who benefited from the princess disappearing before that vote could take place. I found Ailsara in the aftermath, her hands trembling slightly as medics tended to the injured guards nearby, and for the first time since I had met her, I saw genuine fear behind her calm expression, not for herself, but for the people around her, who kept getting hurt because of a fight that was never really theirs to begin with. "This has to stop," she said quietly. "Too many people are being hurt because of decisions I made." "You didn't decide to have a corrupt noble try to blow up a hallway," I said. "He did that. That's on him, not you." "If I had never chosen you," she started, "then your empire would still be dying slowly, and Lord Vesic would still be quietly hoarding power while pretending to protect tradition," I said, cutting her off gently. "You didn't create this problem, Ailsara. You're the first person brave enough to actually try fixing it." She looked at me for a long moment, something soft and grateful crossing her expression despite the exhaustion and fear still lingering there. "You have a strange way of making impossible situations feel slightly less impossible, Daniel Hart." "Comes with the job," I said. "Fixing broken things, remember?" The night before the vote, Lord Vesic made his boldest move yet, one that nearly succeeded in ending everything before the council even had a chance to gather. He arranged for a small group of loyalists within the palace guard, soldiers who owed personal debts to his family, to attempt to remove me quietly from the palace under the pretense of relocating me for safety following the earlier explosion. It was Yura who caught the deception, noticing that the transport orders had never actually been approved by the Emperor's office, and she intercepted the group just as they were preparing to move me through a lower service corridor rarely used by anyone outside palace staff. The confrontation was tense, several soldiers standing between Yura and myself, weapons drawn but hesitant, clearly uncomfortable with orders that were beginning to feel less like protection and more like a kidnapping meant to remove me before I could disrupt the vote entirely. "Stand down," Yura said firmly, her own weapon raised, though her voice remained steady despite the danger. "These orders were never signed by the crown. You are acting outside your authority." For a long, tense moment, nobody moved, and I understood, standing frozen in that narrow corridor, just how close this entire situation had come to ending in violence over something as simple as an unsigned transport order. Then, slowly, One of the soldiers lowered his weapon, followed by another, until the small group backed away entirely, unwilling to risk treason for a lord who might not even protect them if things went wrong. Word of the failed kidnapping spread quickly through the palace, and rather than damaging Aelsara's position further, it seemed to solidify growing doubt among the undecided nobles about just how far Lord Vesic was willing to go to secure power for himself. By the time the council gathered the next morning for the formal vote, the atmosphere in that massive throne room felt entirely different from the tense, hostile energy of my very first introduction months earlier. Lord Vesic stood before the assembled nobles one final time, his composure slightly less smooth than it had been at the start of this entire conflict. "Fellow council members," he began, "the events of recent days only prove further the instability surrounding this succession. I ask again that this council vote to remove Princess Aelsara from her position pending full investigation." Aelsara stepped forward before anyone could respond, her voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. Instability, Lord Vesic? Or desperation, from a man watching his carefully built influence crumble because ordinary people finally learned the truth about why our empire has been slowly dying for generations? A murmur ran through the crowd, and I watched several nobles glance nervously at each other, clearly uncertain now which side truly represented stability and which represented dangerous ambition disguised as tradition. "You would have this council believe an outsider, a creature from an unknown world, holds the answer to problems that have existed since before either of us was born," Lord Vesic said, his voice rising slightly, the first crack in his usual composed confidence. "I would have this council believe the truth," Aelsara said, "which is that our laws have been slowly killing the very bloodline they claim to protect, while men like you have profited quietly from that decline for generations." The vote that followed was closer than any of us had hoped, but in the end, enough nobles, swayed by growing public pressure, by Lord Vesic's increasingly obvious desperation, and by the failed attempts on my life that had crossed clearly from political maneuvering into outright treason, voted against removing Aelsara from her position. Lord Vesic's coalition collapsed almost immediately afterward, several houses quickly distancing themselves from him entirely, unwilling to be associated with a man now facing serious accusations of conspiracy and attempted murder. I remember standing beside Aelsara as the final vote was announced, watching relief and exhaustion wash over her expression in equal measure, and understanding, for the first time since that chaotic morning on Earth when she had first pointed at me in front of thousands of strangers, that whatever this strange, dangerous journey had turned into, it was no longer simply about genetics or survival. It had become something neither of us had fully expected when this all began. "You saved my position today," she said quietly, once the crowded hall had finally begun to empty. "We saved it," I said. "I just helped you fight a fight you'd already been fighting your whole life." She smiled then, small and tired but real, the first smile I had seen from her that seemed to hold no political weight behind it at all. Perhaps my instincts on that landing field were better than either of us realized. "Don't get used to being right all the time," I said, and for a moment, standing in that quiet, emptying hall, surrounded by the wreckage of a political battle we had barely survived, it almost felt like we had found something worth all the danger that had brought us there in the first place. In the weeks following the failed coup, Lord Vesic and his closest allies were formally stripped of their titles and holdings, their crimes laid bare before the same council that had nearly handed them control of an empire. It was not a clean process. Some nobles argued for harsher punishment, others for leniency, in exchange for information about which other houses had quietly supported his ambitions behind closed doors. Aelsara handled each decision with a patience I had not expected from someone who had every reason to want swift, uncomplicated justice after everything Lord Vesic had put her through. "Cruelty breeds resentment," she told me one evening, as we walked through the palace gardens that had slowly become one of the few places we could speak without the constant presence of guards and advisors. If I destroy every house connected to him without mercy, I create enemies for generations to come. Exactly the kind of resentment that started this entire crisis centuries ago. So what happens to them instead? I asked. Those with lesser involvement will lose privileges, but keep their lives, and some standing, she said. Those directly involved in violence, including the attempts on your life, will face proper justice under our laws. It will not be quick, and it will not satisfy everyone, but it will be fair. I found myself admiring that about her more than almost anything else during those difficult weeks, the way she balanced justice with mercy, understanding that an empire built entirely on punishment and fear was no better than one built on rigid, outdated tradition. It reminded me, in a strange way, of fixing machines back home, understanding that sometimes the goal wasn't just removing what was broken, but making sure the replacement parts actually fit together well enough to last. With Lord Vesick's coalition scattered and the immediate danger past, attention within the palace slowly shifted toward the succession laws themselves, the very thing that had caused this entire crisis in the first place. Aelsara called for a full council session, not to punish anyone further, but to finally address the question that had been avoided for generations: whether the empire's ruling bloodline should continue restricting marriage strictly within a handful of noble houses, or whether it was time, after everything that had happened, to finally change. The debate that followed was long and difficult, filled with nobles arguing tradition on one side and survival on the other, but Aelsara approached it differently than I expected, not by demanding immediate, sweeping change, but by presenting the healer's data plainly, allowing the council to see, in clear and simple terms, exactly how close the empire had come to losing its ruling family entirely because of laws written thousands of years earlier for reasons that no longer serve the people they were meant to protect. "I am not asking this council to abandon tradition," she said, standing before the assembled nobles one final time. "I am asking this council to recognize that tradition without adaptation is simply another word for decay. Our ancestors created these laws to preserve strength and stability. They did not create them to become the reason our bloodline eventually disappears entirely." The vote to formally reform the succession laws passed with a majority far larger than any of us had expected only months earlier, allowing future marriages within the royal bloodline to include partners from outside the traditional noble houses, provided genetic compatibility could be properly verified by the empire's healers. It was not a complete overhaul of every tradition the Zarathi held dear, but it was enough. A crack in centuries-old walls that had nearly caused an entire civilization to collapse under the weight of its own rigid history. News of the reform spread quickly beyond the palace, and for the first time since my arrival, I began noticing a shift in how ordinary citizens looked at me when I walked through parts of the city with Aelsara at my side. Where before there had been confusion, suspicion, sometimes open hostility from those who did not understand why an outsider had been chosen to help save their empire, there was now a quieter kind of curiosity, even gratitude, from people who understood that the reforms happening within their government meant fewer families would be forced into loveless arranged marriages simply to preserve outdated bloodlines. A young woman named Ilara, working in one of the palace kitchens, once stopped me in a hallway to thank me, her voice shaking slightly with nervousness at speaking so directly to someone she still clearly saw as important, though not in the way the old nobility once demanded. "My sister was promised to a house she has never even met," she told me. "Because of the reforms, that arrangement was dissolved. She is free now to choose someone she actually cares for." It was a small story, one of countless similar ones happening quietly across the empire, but it stayed with me more than almost anything else during those months, a reminder that this entire dangerous, complicated journey had never really been about me at all. It had been about giving people, ordinary people who never had a voice in ancient laws written long before they were born, a chance at something better. Word of everything happening on the Zorathi homeworld eventually made its way back to Earth as well, filtered carefully through diplomatic channels, though the full story, including the assassination attempts and near coup, remained largely private, shared only with select officials who understood the delicate nature of everything unfolding. General Kane sent a message through Ellen Ross, congratulating me on what he called a diplomatic success beyond anything anyone had expected from a maintenance technician thrust suddenly into interstellar politics. Oliver Grant's message, forwarded along with the official reports, made me laugh for the first time in weeks. He simply asked if being an alien prince meant I finally had a good enough excuse to stop answering his messages about fixing his truck, since apparently saving an entire civilization was a slightly better reason than being too busy with work back home. As the political situation slowly stabilized, Ilsara and I found more time to simply exist together, away from council chambers and public appearances, learning about each other in ways the chaos of the previous months had never allowed. She asked endless questions about Earth, about simple human customs that seemed strange to her, laughing genuinely, without any political weight behind it, when I tried explaining the concept of small talk about weather to fill silence between people who barely knew each other. "Your species finds comfort in discussing things you cannot control," she said one evening, clearly amused. "That seems inefficient." "It's not about efficiency," I said. "Sometimes people just want an easy way to connect, without diving straight into anything serious." "I think I understand," she said softly. "Perhaps that is what these months have been for us as well, in a way, finding easier ways to connect, buried somewhere beneath everything serious we were forced to face together." It was during one of those quiet evenings, sitting together in the palace gardens beneath a sky slowly shifting from amber to deep violet, that Ilsara finally asked me something she had never directly asked since that first chaotic day on the landing field back on Earth. "Do you regret choosing to come here?" she asked, knowing everything that has happened since. I thought about the question carefully before answering, remembering the fear of that first morning, the danger of assassination attempts and political coups, the strange, difficult adjustment to an entirely new world and its ancient, complicated customs. But I also thought about the quiet moments since then, the genuine friendship I had built with Yura, the gratitude in Ilara's voice as she spoke about her sister's newfound freedom, and most of all, the woman sitting beside me, who had trusted me with the truth from the very beginning, even when it would have been easier to hide behind political language and careful half-truths. "No," I said finally, "I don't regret it. I think, somewhere along the way, this stopped being about genetics or survival for me, and started being about you, about the people here who deserved better than what centuries of broken tradition gave them." She looked at me for a long moment, something soft and unguarded crossing her expression, the same expression I had seen glimpses of during our quietest, most honest conversations over the previous months. "I believe I feel the same way, Daniel Hart," she said quietly. "What began as necessity has become something I did not expect to find in all of this." Our formal marriage ceremony took place several months later, once the political situation had fully stabilized and the new succession laws had been properly established throughout the empire. It was nothing like the chaotic, public spectacle of our first meeting on that Earth landing field. Instead, it was a quieter, more meaningful ceremony held within the palace gardens themselves, attended by close advisors, remaining loyal nobles, and a small group of representatives sent from Earth to witness what officials on both sides now openly called the beginning of a genuine alliance between our two worlds. Standing there, beneath skies that shifted gently from amber to violet as the ceremony began, I found myself thinking back to that morning months earlier, standing frozen with a wrench still in my hand, listening to an alien princess point directly at me and declare, with no explanation at all, that she needed a husband. It had seemed impossible then, terrifying even, The idea that a random maintenance technician could somehow matter to an empire spanning countless worlds and billions of lives. But standing there now, watching El Sara approach through gardens filled with flowers that had somehow, over the following weeks, come to feel like home to me, I understood something I had not fully grasped during those first chaotic days. Being chosen had never really been about my usefulness, about genetic markers or survival statistics carefully recorded by alien scanners orbiting a planet I had never expected to leave. It had been about choice, about what someone decides to do with an opportunity they never expected to receive. I had been given a chance, strange and frightening as it was, to help repair something that had been broken for far longer than either of us had been alive. And in choosing to stay, to fight for El Sara, and for the people of an empire I had known nothing about only months earlier, I had found something I never expected when I first stepped outside that morning, with grease still on my hands, wondering why the sky had suddenly turned orange above a base that had, until that moment, felt like the safest, most ordinary place in the entire world. Genetics had brought El Sara and me together, but it was choice, hers and mine both, that turned a desperate necessity into something neither of us had expected to find among the stars. A partnership built not on old laws or ancient bloodlines, but on the simple, stubborn decision to keep choosing each other, one difficult, dangerous day at a time, until an entire empire finally learned to do the same.